From Overland Park to Parkville, you're listening to Mundo in the Morning on 95.7 FM, KCMO Talk Radio.
Well, speaking of Parkville, there's some action up there that's not getting nearly as much attention in Platte County. And David Stokes is with the Show Me Institute. He is joining us here on KCMO Talk Radio, Missouri-based think tank. David, good morning. What is going to be voted on in Platte County coming up in a couple of weeks?
Good morning, Pete. Great to be on the air with you. And yeah, Platte County and Cass County are two counties of like 97 counties in the state of Missouri that are voting on really strict property tax increase limitations on the ballot here in 2 weeks. In Cass County, it's 0% through reassessment, meaning taxes can only go up through a vote of the people. In Platte County, it's a little less strict. It's 5%. Can go up through reassessment, but that's it. And I know a lot of your listeners will assume I support this idea, but I don't. And I've got a letter to the editor of the Platte County Landmark that I hope people can check out. I think it's way too strict. We should be depending at the local level more on property taxes and less on, for example, earnings taxes in Kansas City, including obviously the part of Kansas City in Platte and Cass counties. So I think it's going in the wrong direction here to place these really severe limit on property tax increases. And we've got, besides the Platte County Landmark op-ed, we've got pieces at showmeinstitute.org up about it as well. I like. Does it?
Let me ask you. Does it cap the assessment at 5% or the actual dollar figure in property taxes at 5%?
It caps in Platte County. It caps the actual dollar figure that the most your house taxes can go up at is 5% in Platte County. And I think the 0% option that certain counties are impacting, so it cannot go up at all, even if your house really goes up in value. And that's the nice thing about property taxes. They're neither progressive or regressive. They just sort of are. If your house goes up in value, you might pay a little bit more. And the Cass County 0% change is the really strict one, and I think that's way too far.
What does that do? What do you mean? What does that do? What does that do in Cass County?
I mean, your property taxes will not go up at all unless voters approve a property tax increase. The reassessment, even if your house goes up substantially in value, you're not going to see any increase in property taxes. And I just think it's way too strict. Here we are trying to phase out income taxes at the state level, and those income taxes go to pay for things, through the state's foundation formula like schools in Cass County and Platte County. And these new limits on how those schools are going to fund themselves locally sort of works at cross purposes here. So I think it's way too strict and harmful. Income taxes and earnings taxes do a lot more harm to economic growth than property taxes, and they're focused on the wrong thing here, I think.
David Stokes with the Show Me Institute here on KCMO. So, listen, this debate's going on in Kansas as well right now. They're trying to figure out some kind of legislation to at least slow down the increase in property taxes that largely are driven by the counties, the cities, and the schools. What do you think the answer is to all this then?
Well, the answer is, at least in Jackson County, which has just been a unique property tax disaster for a decade, it's in Jackson County at least, it's electing the assessor and it's having accountability for people who can't even run an assessment office and are just sticking it to taxpayers right and left. In Jackson County, it's also getting rid of the Kansas City 33 school district exemption on tax rollbacks, which is just killing people who live there. But the overall answer is, I think, what they did for assessments in Platte County this year, where because of the prior assessor just sort of completely absconded on his duties, they just rolled everybody's assessment, all homes, up the same amount, making it much easier to then roll rates back the same amount so that you don't have these extreme differences from house to house. You treated everybody the same instead of some people seeing a big assessment increase and some people seeing none at all. Everybody basically got treated the same on an average basis. And I think that's, for Missouri at least, I'm not quite as knowledgeable about how they do it in Kansas, But for Missouri, at least, I think that's the long-term solution.
Well, it seems like it's all the same playbook, right? But all these municipalities and all these counties, they want to get their hands on every last dollar they can get their hands on. So they have this absurd process that, frankly, doesn't seem to be very accurate and is really just intended to grow government. So is there a way that you think states can rein that in to some extent or not necessarily?
Well, you need to enforce tax rate rollbacks better. That's the main thing. You need to crack down on school districts that are, as I understand, happened in Platte County, that are taking some of their funds and switching them to the debt fund, and this gets a little in the weeds, I admit, but they're switching it to the debt fund because you don't have to roll that rate back. And so you need to really crack down and say when assessments go up, you, school district, fire district, county, whatever, you do have to roll your rates back to offset that. And far too often, especially in Jackson County, which has, again, just been a disaster for a decade, you don't see that happen. So assessments go up a lot, and then the rates only roll back a little bit, and people really get nailed, and people get angry over that. And it's totally understandable. But it then moves people in the wrong direction of trying to phase out, trying to kill property taxes or phase out property tax increases. Well, I'm here to tell you that hate them all you want, and people certainly hate them, but the Kansas City earnings tax, the Missouri state income tax, these are the taxes that harm economic growth far more than your property taxes do. And when we're right now, we seem to be targeting both, and that's not going to work. So let's try to phase out the earnings tax and the state income tax and allow schools and the like to continue to fund themselves with property taxes as much as they can. Not meaning I want higher taxes, but let that continue to be the basis of their funding.
David Stokes with the Show Me Institute. Last up then, David, on that earnings tax vote in Kansas City coming up in a couple of weeks. I mean, this stuff always passes, especially this one, passes overwhelmingly every 5 years because residents of Kansas City get told, hey, your services get subsidized by people who work here but do not live here and have no vote on this earnings tax. So how is this ever going to change? And do you see it ever changing?
Well, I see it changing if the state legislature says it stops allowing it to be a choice and says, and we might have to change the Constitution to allow this because it was voted on statewide last time to institute these every 5-year votes. But I do think it probably has to be done as a statewide change to force Kansas City and St. Louis to phase out that earnings tax. Not to get rid of it overnight. That would be a disaster for Kansas City government. But to phase it out over a decade and replace it with some combination of higher alternative taxes that don't harm the economy as much as an earnings tax does, as well as, fewer tax subsidies, sharing services with other cities and perhaps Jackson County, cuts to government spending. I mean, every government can cut its spending if it's serious enough about it. You can do a number of things if given, 10 years or so to phase that out. But it's not really going to happen until that's forced on them because you summed it up perfectly at the start. You give the people a choice and say, hey, do you want to tax other people for your stuff? And of course, most people are going to say yes to that.
Mm-hmm. It's just how it goes, sad to say. But I heard that this morning there's actually a bill being heard in Jefferson City about separating Jackson County from Kansas City, and that would not be good in terms of shared services and a more efficient government. So that's just something to watch. David Stokes with the Show Me Institute. Go ahead, David.
I would not recommend that. That's how it's done in St. Louis, and it's been that way for a long time. So they've made it work on that side of the state a little bit, but that is not something I would recommend, taking Kansas City out of Jackson County or the other counties it's in, making it an independent city. I do not think I don't think that's a good idea at all.
Yeah. All right. We'll talk more about that. David Stokes, good work, my man. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Pete. We got a podcast up at showmeinstitute.org that talks about all these tax increases, including fire district tax increases in Jackson County as well. So a whole bunch at showmeinstitute.org.
All right. Keep up the great work. David Stokes on KCMO Talk Radio.